through the woods of Milbridge, Maine, in the winter of 1803, you would have heard the wolves. You would have heard the wind snapping the frozen pine branches. But if you got close to the grey stone walls of the Ashford Estate, you might have heard something else. Or worse, you might have heard nothing at all. For 30 years, 600 women walked through the iron gates of what was called the Convent of Eternal Tears. They were daughters, wives, and mothers who went in seeking God, peace, or forgiveness. Fewer than half of them ever came out alive. The ones who did return were simply not the same women anymore. They smiled, but their eyes were completely empty. They obeyed every command, but they didn't remember who they were. They were walking shells, hollowed out by something that was happening in a basement hidden deep beneath the Maine wilderness. This wasn't a church, nor was it a sanctuary. It was a laboratory run by women who weren't nuns. They were fugitives hiding in plain sight, conducting the most brutal medical experiment in American history, a century before science had a name for it. Tonight, we open the files that were sealed for 100 years. We are going back to 1798 to uncover the impossible surgery, the black market of human souls, and the one woman brave enough to burn it all to the ground. To understand the horror, you have to understand the trap set in October of 1798. Milbridge was a rough frontier town of lumberjacks and fishermen fighting the Atlantic Ocean. It was dirty, cold, and hard, so when the Ashford women rolled into town, it was like royalty had arrived. They came in a horse-drawn wagon loaded with heavy crates and endless bags of gold. There were 3 of them, starting with the matriarch, Mother Superior, Agatha. She had silver hair, steel-grey eyes, and an accent that sounded like the finest parlours of London. She didn't ask for things, she commanded them. Then there was Sister Prudence, who was tall, pale, and ghost-like. The locals noticed her hands immediately because they were long, slender fingers that never shook. They were perfect hands for a surgeon. Finally, there was the young beauty, Novice Temperance, with dark hair and porcelain skin. She looked at people the way a butcher looks at a prize cow, assessing the meat while ignoring the soul. They claimed to be Anglican nuns fleeing persecution, a tragic backstory that the locals ate up. With their gold, they bought 200 acres of isolated forest and paid triple the value with no questions asked. Construction began immediately, but the builders started talking. This didn't look like a convent. It looked like a fortress. The walls were 3 feet thick with stone quarried from the coast. The windows were tiny and placed high up so no one could see inside. But the strangest part was the basement. Why did a house of prayer need a basement with reinforced concrete floors and drainage systems designed for large amounts of fluid? When asked, Agatha smiled that chilling, serene smile and said that penitence requires silence. They believed her gold, but they should have looked closer at the crates the sisters were hauling in. They weren't Bibles. There were crate after crate of medical steel. The trap was built and the bait was set. You might think they kidnapped people off the street, but that is not the case. The terrifying truth is that the victims were sent there by the people who were supposed to love them. The Convent of Eternal Tears opened its doors with a promise of total reformation. In the early 1800s, if you had a difficult daughter or a wife who argued, she was considered a problem. The Ashford Sisters offered a solution, promising to cure these women of their rebellion for a fortune of $100. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the local physician, became their biggest cheerleader. He sent them patients and praised their deep understanding of feminine hysteria. What he didn't tell anyone was that he was on their payroll and selling his patients for monthly kickbacks. The first women began to return home after a few months, and the families were delighted. Take Mary Prescott, who was fiery, independent, and stubborn before the convent. After 6 months with the sisters, she came back quiet and obedient. She sat where you put her, ate what you gave her, and didn't argue. In fact, she didn't speak unless spoken to. When her mother showed her a childhood toy, Mary just stared at it, with no recognition or emotion. It was as if the part of her brain that held Mary had been scooped out. Her parents ignored the strange, thin white scars hidden under her hairline because they had paid for a compliant daughter. The town called it a miracle and named it spiritual healing. But one winter night, a young hunter named Thomas Brewster found out what healing actually sounded like. In February of 1803, a blizzard was burying Maine and Thomas Brewster was lost near the convent walls. He expected silence, but instead, he heard a sound that froze his blood darker than the cold ever could. It was a rhythmic, rising scream of raw, biological agony followed by the sound of sawing. Thomas crept to a basement window that was partially unblocked, wiped the frost away, and looked down into hell. It wasn't a prayer circle. It was an operating theatre brilliantly lit by dozens of oil lamps. A woman was strapped to a table with heavy leather restraints, and her head was clamped in a metal vise. There was Sister Prudence, the woman with the delicate hands. She wasn't holding a rosary. She was holding a drill. Thomas watched as she bored a hole into the living woman's skull with no anesthesia. Next to her, Mother Superior Agatha stood with a notebook, calmly writing down data instead of praying. She noted that the subject's motor functions were ceasing and the screaming had stopped. Thomas ran until his lungs burned, crashing through the snow while terrified that they would see him. When he told the town elders and the deacon, they didn't believe him. Agatha explained it away effortlessly by claiming it was an exorcism where demons scream upon leaving the body. The town accepted it because the alternative was too horrifying to imagine. So the screaming stopped, not because the torture ended, but because the sisters soundproofed the walls. For 15 years, they operated in the dark until the day they made a mistake. They admitted a woman named Sarah Wittmann, and Sarah wasn't broken. She was angry. It was 1818, and Sarah was sent to the convent for having a child out of wedlock. Her wealthy Boston family wanted her erased, but Sarah was educated and had read medical texts. The moment she walked in, she didn't see holiness. She saw symptoms. She saw the other women slurring their speech and realized the sisters were damaging specific parts of the brain to delete personality traits. Sarah played the long game, pretending to break and acting docile. Then, in March of 1819, a flood hit the basement and chaos erupted. While the sisters were distracted moving equipment, Sarah slipped away looking for evidence. Hidden in the back of the basement, she found letters from universities in Vienna, Berlin, and Harvard. The sisters weren't just torturing women. They were selling the data to the world's top medical schools. They were running a global business based on illegal human experimentation results. The answer to how much brain tissue must be removed to stop a woman from reading was in those files. Sarah grabbed the papers and a surgical logbook, and then she ran. This wasn't just a walk in the woods. This was a hunt where the sisters unleashed men with dogs. For 3 days, Sarah survived on instinct, bleeding and hiding in hollow logs, while men walked inches from her head. She made it to the next town and collapsed in the sheriff's office. For the first time in 20 years, someone listened, and the sheriff assembled a posse of 15 armed men. They rode out to burn the place down and hang the witches. But when they kicked down the heavy oak doors, the silence was back. What they found inside was worse than any horror story, for the Ashford Sisters had fled in the night. They vanished with their golden research, but they left the failures behind. In the basement, the sheriff found hundreds of jars containing preserved human brains, labeled with names. Behind a false wall, they found 47 bodies of women who had died on the table preserved in tanks. The investigation revealed the true identity of the nuns as Dr. Agatha Brennan, Dr. Prudence Ashford, and Dr. Temperance Ashford. They were 3 disgraced physicians kicked out of Europe for illegal human experimentation. They had come to America to find a supply of lab rats that no one would miss. You want to know the most sickening part? They got away with it, and Agatha was rumored to be seen in Paris years later. But their legacy didn't disappear. The findings from the Convent of Eternal Tears were quietly absorbed into medical history. Prestigious universities used the data Sarah found to advance neurology, but they deleted the source. We build our understanding of the human mind on a foundation of bones buried in the Maine woods. Sarah Wittmann lived the rest of her life in hiding, traumatized by what she saw. The convent was burned to the ground, and nothing remains there now but moss and stones. But the next time you hear about a miracle cure, remember the Ashford women. Remember that sometimes the monsters don't look like monsters, they look like saviors.